Hello, good afternoon and good morning, everyone. It's 3 p.m. in Europe, 2 p.m. in London, and 9 a.m. in the East Coast United States. Thank you all for joining LinkedIn Live session. Today we have a special guest, Benoit Wirtz. Hello, Benoit.
Hi, Mike. How are you?
Fine, thank you. How are you? So today we will be talking a little bit what you are doing, what are your, let's say, professional interests, what is doing Bright Eye. If you could tell a few words about yourself, I think this would be a good start.
Sure. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me. So I'm a partner at Bright Eye Ventures. Bright Eye is the leading education technology focused venture capital fund in Europe. Personally, I've been investing in education technology since 2010. When I started a fund investing in edtech and media startups in the US as part of the Knight Foundation, and have been with Bright Eye since the beginning in 2017.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, then, so perhaps something, let's say, easier for start. Currently, we are reaching, let's say, slightly post-pandemic circumstances. Yeah, like children worldwide are coming back to schools, students are coming back to universities. We are coming back to, let's say, stationary education, at least partially. What are the, let's say, the most emerging trends following the pandemics? Yeah, because some of the things that have been invented or have been introduced seem like they will be remaining with us. Yeah, some solutions for remote scholarship and so on and so on. How does it look like from your perspective?
Yeah, no, I think that's true. I think I think some of the stuff will remain with us, and some of the stuff will go away. That's good. That kind of the nature of this. I think there's certainly an increased interest in platforms that facilitate the return to in-person learning in some cases. And so, even for large tutoring platforms, for example, tutoring was one of the online tutoring was one of the sort of the industries that boomed during the pandemic. A lot of people turned to online tutoring for the first time because they had to, and then found that they really enjoyed the experience, that it was cheaper and more convenient in a lot of ways. And so big companies were built on the back of that, including GoStudent here in Europe and Byju's in India, and there are analogous companies kind of around the world. I would say that what's interesting. One of the things that's interesting is even for those larger, primarily online businesses, there has been post-pandemic some move to look at in person. So Byju's, which is valued at 20+ billion in the last round, and which has a largely online product for school-age children in India and increasingly around the world, purchased a company, an offline tutoring company, for about $1 billion in the middle of last year. And similarly, GoStudent, I think, is looking at putting some in-person tutoring in place as well, even though they're a largely offline company. I think for both of them, what they view it as is sort of lead generation for the online product. So one broad trend is that there is more interest, certainly than there was during the pandemic, in the platforms that facilitate the transition between offline and online learning. I think the other thing, which is probably less in the K-12 school children space, but more in terms of adult education, is there's a raging war for talent, that's happening across startups and more mature companies, particularly, everything that's innovation economy. But honestly, that war for talent exists in nursing, it exists in teachers, it exists kind of throughout the sort of industries, and so there's increasing interest on the part of investors in investing in companies that help industry address that war for talent in any number of different ways, whether it's through better screening of talent of sort of prospective applicants on the front end, whether it's through training of junior level talent. So companies, for example, in our portfolio, like Ironhack and Patika and Iconoclast, which help people get sort of the skills they need to become entry level web developers, entry-level software sales representatives or business development representatives, entry-level data science, that sort of stuff. There's a ton of interest in that, and what's those kinds of companies. And then increasingly, once you have the right people in place, there's also interest in technologies and services that help keep those people happy, unsurprisingly, because they're fairly expensive to find. And so, for example, a company in our portfolio called Skiller Whale, which helps sort of mid to senior level developers, software developers, maintain their skills or learn new programming languages in a very personalized way, is kind of a perk that chief technology officers are very interested in offering. And so those kinds of on the job sort of learning platforms are quite popular as well.
Okay, thank you very much for.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I think it would be worth to mention that Bright Eye is frequently sharing very comprehensive reports about this, let's say, situation in the edtech. I'm not hiding the fact that today I will be referring to one of these reports that you have published very, very recently. I think that our guests, it would be very, very worthy if they could visit your website and download it, because there's plenty of knowledge there. So one of the fun facts that I found is, according to your report, the investment in educational startups tripled in just 2 years, while the average single transaction has become 4 times bigger. What caused that shift, obviously, besides the pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, I think the pandemic was really more of an accelerant than a disruptor for the edtech industry. I mean, certainly it broadened the general public's awareness of the fact that you could learn effectively online, but practically speaking, half of learning was already happening online. The big change, the big sort of imbalance, is that 95% of spend in education was still happening, and to a large extent is still happening offline. So even though we're doing half of our learning online, we're spending 95% of our learning dollars offline. And so that's the big opportunity. And because education is an $8 trillion industry, that's actually a $3 or $4, $5 trillion gap, depending on how you measure it. And so there's a huge opportunity for companies that help basically monetize the activity that was already largely happening pre-pandemic, and that certainly accelerated during the pandemic and continues today. So I think the first sort of thing that happens, that people's learning shifted pre-pandemic online and accelerated during the pandemic. I think the second thing that happened is, I've been, as I mentioned, investing in this industry since 2010. In 2010, it was really hard to point to exits. It was really hard to point to anyone other than Blackboard, honestly. I think, but there was really less than a handful of companies that had built big, valuable education technology sort of enterprises. And one of the things that changed over the last couple of years was that actually you saw an increasing number of companies not just sort of grow, but also exit in the space. And so there were a number of IPOs, including Duolingo, Coursera, Udemy, as well as sort of big private transactions in the space. So companies like Stack Overflow, which got purchased for 1.7 billion by Prosus, actually here in Europe. And so the second thing that happened was just there was a recognition that not just was there activity in the space, but also actually there was money to be made in the space. And so unsurprisingly, those two things meant that investors started to pay more attention and realized that actually, particularly at the later stages, good edtech companies look a lot like good companies that they're familiar with. So a good edtech consumer-facing company looks like a good consumer company. A good edtech B2B facing company looks like a good B2B company. And similar for companies that are selling into schools and universities. If you have characteristics that define a good SaaS company, high net revenue retention and good growth, that ultimately who the buyer is matters less than do I understand this business as a sort of from a numbers perspective. I think so all that meant that there was more willingness from investors to invest in these companies, and ultimately that will lead to a continuance of the kind of outcomes that we saw in the last 2 or 3 years.
Okay, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, in the comment section on LinkedIn, you can already see links directing you to Bright Eye Venture website, where you can download the report and get to know Bright Eye even more. I would like to encourage our audience to use the comment section in order to ask your questions. If any questions come up, please feel free to use the comment section to ask questions to Benoit. Okay, then. So what does it mean that the portion of VC deals below 1 million euro decreases for pre-seed or seed startups? Is it harder for them to collect the first financing round? What has changed here?
Yeah, the short answer is no. I think what's happened is that venture capital funds have gotten bigger, as a rule over the last couple of years, and so therefore they're writing bigger checks, and so the earlier stage checks are not coming from venture capital funds; they're coming from angels. Apologies, coming in. Yeah, they're coming from angel investors, and so that's one thing that's happening, and the second thing that's happening is just the size of the later stage checks have gotten bigger and bigger, and so to some extent they're crowding out the earlier stage checks as a percentage of the money that's being invested, but the absolute number of deals at the early stage actually hasn't changed that much, and so it's just those two factors.
Okay, thank you very much for this. I know that besides, let's say, smaller initiatives, you actually have one unicorn already in your portfolio, and this is edtech. First of all, congratulations for this. I don't want to make it like a silly joke, but it sounds epic. If you could tell us a little bit about the story behind this particular initiative, because it's just amazing.
Sure. And just to be more specific, I mean, edtech was sold for $500 million last year. It was an investment that we made starting in 2017. So I guess it's half a unicorn. But the company is essentially similar to Netflix, except instead of movies, what they distribute is children's books. And they did two things, I think, well, three things really well. One is the founding team was incredibly talented and built a great team around them. The second is that they were able to acquire children's books that children actually wanted to read, which is not as obvious as it sounds, because convincing Sesame Street or Curious George or Lego or sort of the sort of kind of big brands that children are drawn to contribute, to participate, was not an easy task, and they essentially started with more independent publishers, and then were able to use the traction that they got with independent publishers to bring on more mainstream publishers. And the third thing that they did was they distributed entirely free in schools. So the product was available for teachers to use in classrooms with all their children. And then that made it easy for teachers to recommend the product to parents, because they were using it every day. They were creating quizzes about the books that parents could access at home, and then parents would subscribe to the product for their child to be able to access it at home. And so they grew quite nicely, and as a result, were purchased by Juice last year.
Well, thank you very much for this. Congratulations. If you could tell our audience, because you mentioned public schools, where edtech is operating, which markets these are?
Yeah, it's primarily in the U.S. So the U.S. is by far their biggest market. They're operating, I think, a bit in the U.K. and there are other languages available, but they're by far and away their largest market is the U.S.
Okay, thank you for this. Okay, then we talked a little bit about big players. Now perhaps few words about the newbies. what would be your advice for startup founders? So someone who is, let's say, applying to you, is talking to you for the first time, or perhaps not even to you, or perhaps some even smaller VC. What preparations should be taken? What is the process? What are, let's say, advantages of startups that can expect, let's say, their first funding rounds?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, I think that, look, there's a ton of material about, how to raise funds online. I would
Mm-hmm.
recommend, for starting there. But I think the three things that maybe are less talked about that I've found that are helpful. One is actually start by talking to the not the sort of current round of investors, but your next round of investors, right? So if you're raising a seed stage, the most useful thing is actually to start by talking to Series A stage investors. You don't have to talk to a ton of them, but if you can talk to a handful of them, it's useful for two reasons. One is you can tell them straight away that that you're not a fit for them. So it's not a high pressure conversation. It really is a relationship building exercise. And so, 12, 18, 24 months from then, they'll recognize who you are. And if you ease the pressure right away, it's a good way to build a relationship. But the really valuable thing that you can get from them is a sense of what it is that they would need to see to be interested in the business in 12 to 18 to 24 months. And then you can build that into your story, right? To the extent that you haven't done this before, it's particularly helpful to know exactly what the benchmarks are. I will say that the current environment is a bit sort of turbulent, so it may be hard to know exactly what people will be looking for in 18 to 24 months, but generally speaking, I think it's still worth doing the exercise of trying to understand not what this round of investors wants, but what the next round of investors wants, so that you can tell this round of investors that's exactly what you're going to do, and it will make you look better in their eyes. So that's one. I think the second thing to know is that it's a numbers game. It really is. Like, if you're not talking in any round, if you're not prepared to talk to 100 or more folks, you're probably not preparing. Well, I think in a recent podcast I heard from a venture fund that raised a 1.4 billion. They said that they had done 2,500 meetings to get to 1.4 billion, which seems on one hand it's a big number, but on the other hand, it kind of gives you a sense. And this was their second fund. They were very successful, but still, even for guys who are sort of know exactly what they're doing and have a great track record to talk about, it still takes work. And so I would say because it's a numbers game. It can kill your business if you don't try to concentrate those meetings over a relatively short period of time. And so try to understand that you need 100 names to begin with. Try to contact them all at once, as opposed to every couple of weeks, and then try to get those meetings scheduled as much as possible, or as much as possible concurrently, because the only pressure really you have to get investors to process the deal quickly is that you're talking to other investors, and so they'll know that actually there is some time limit on this. And then the last thing I would say in terms of advice is just be sure you know how to manage no's, and try to understand what no means, right? So for most of the people you're going to talk to are going to tell you no. That's just the way it is. And so when that happens, you need to really understand whether it's no, and I will never invest in this business, in which case that's actually super useful information to understand. You can take them off your list. Or it's no, but I would be interested in investing in business later, or when you've proven X, Y, and Z, or whatever it is, right? So if it's a no, but it's really useful to understand the no buts. And then the sort of most productive way to kind of then recirculate or to operationalize the no's is to then have a monthly or every other month update for those investors who said no but, and say, hey, look, this is what we said we were going to do. This is what we're doing. You don't have to explicitly ask for money, although if you're raising a new round, you should mention that. But most startups don't do what they said they were going to do. So if you are able to just prove that over 2 to 4 to 6 to 8, 12-month period, whatever it is, that you are actually executing on your plan, that will put you in the top tier of startups right away, and then investors will reach out eventually if they're interested. So that's those are the advice I would do.
Okay, thank you very much for this. Most of the startups, educational technology startups, they rely on some platforms like mobile, desktop, and so on. Very recently, I read a book from Jean Twenge. It was called iGene, which was about, let's say, the generation of young adults and children, basically, which learned with how to live, basically, with technologies and so on. And I wouldn't like to say that they are, let's say, addicted or something like that, but they are very, very strongly adopted to the technology. And one of the advices coming from her was to, for example, introduce children to possibly late moment to technology as possible, which is almost impossible, because everybody has an iPhone and so on. What are, let's say, the risks in the edtech world? What can eventually disrupt in a negative way your field, your industry? What is considered as a, let's say, eventual major risk, if there are some, let's say, recognized major risks in your industry?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly, I think for platforms that facilitate live interactions, so like a babysitting marketplace or or even a live tutoring marketplace, there's a direct safeguarding risk in anything that where you have direct interactions between children and adults. I think that those risks become exist on tutoring platforms, as on online platforms as well as offline platforms, but obviously they're magnified when you have an offline sort of interaction. And that's something that we take quite seriously. And honestly, one of the reasons that we haven't invested in sort of platforms that reinvent daycare is because of that safeguarding risk. It's not something that we're super comfortable with. You can imagine it's one thing to have people trash your house if when they rent it on Airbnb. It's another thing for somebody to sort of abuse a child. It's just not something it's not a risk we're willing to take. So that is, I would say, a relatively small subset of edtech companies, but certainly a risk that they need to manage. And the way you manage that risk is essentially by vetting the quality of the tutors or professors or adults, basically professional adults that you have on the platform. And so I think most companies do a good job of that. More broadly, is spending time online good for your kids, right? I think that's the sort of more existential sort of risk you could talk about. All the research shows that actually there's not, it's not so much. I mean, despite Marshall McLuhan's statement that the medium is the message, it's not so much about how much time people spend online. It's about what they do when they're there, right? And I think the reality is that although actually the amount of time that kids spend watching TV and doing sort of traditional media stuff has gone down, the amount of time that they spent on a screen is higher than it's ever been, and that's just the nature of sort of video games and social media and things that kids actually like to do. I guess I would answer your question slightly differently. The opportunity for edtech companies is to provide motivation to use that screen time to learn as opposed to do something else, right? It's not so much about, for me anyway, certainly if you have the time and resources to keep your kids away from screens and at the same time train them, by all means do that. That's probably a fairly effective way to sort of get your kids to learn. The reality is that most people aren't in that position. And so the opportunity for edtech companies to say, okay, can we motivate kids to spend time learning in their screen time as opposed to doing something else with it. And so I think companies like Epic, which sort of provide a rich experience and allow you to split through 30,000 books and find the ones you like, give you much more incentive to keep reading than even sitting in a library where you have a more limited amount of books, and you have to find the ones that you like in a more analog fashion. And so I would argue that actually that opportunity, for well-designed products, you can sort of create a better experience than you would offline. And those are the kinds of companies that we're looking to fund.
Okay, thank you very much for this. I think this is very important information, very useful. Thank you very much for this. Seems like we have one question coming from our audience. Marta Pasternak is asking, which new trends will dominate in the edtech industry in the nearest future? I think we slightly touched it in the beginning, but perhaps some additional thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think this, if the way I like to look at this is edtech really can do four things in terms of improving the learning experience, right? One is it can lower the cost of a learning experience. So, you can think about an online tutor versus an offline tutor. Even if nothing else changes, if you get access to the same quality tutor that you would have had offline, you can pay a lower price. That's worth something, right? And so, for example, there's a company in our portfolio called Ornicar, which provides, essentially, it's like Uber for driving instructors. So you have access to driving instructors who come to your house and give you your driving lesson. And because they remove the need to A, go to a physical building, and B, pay for that physical building, they can actually pay the driving instructors more while charging students less. And so, it's more convenient as well, but even if it was the same level of convenience, because you're paying less, it's a better experience, right? So that's one thing that edtech products can do. Two is you can increase the relevance of learning. So a big part of learning, the problem with learning today is that people spend time learning things that actually either are not relevant to their personal and professional goals, or they don't seem relevant to their personal and professional goals. And so, the classic example is a boot camp like Ironhack, which we're invested in. They have, in the most recent published report, they had 90% job placement rates, right? So after 3 months of a boot camp, my partner Alex went to Oxford. I think what he likes to say is when he graduated from Oxford University, the job placement rate was something like 70%, right? So you can, in 3 months, you can get you can find a training that is both hyper relevant to your own personal and professional goals, and also relevant to the labor market. And so that's not necessarily, honestly, a technology advantage, but it is just the advantage of creating new learning products, and you can be more relevant to what people are actually looking for. And then the third sort of thing that edtech can do is to be more efficient. So you can think about just more learning per hour, and even if you spent the same amount of time learning. So the example I like to give here is a company called TeachFX, which is in our portfolio. TeachFX is essentially a coach for teachers. And so there's tons of research that shows that actually the best way one of the best ways for students to learn is to actually participate in a conversation with their teachers. Unsurprisingly, teachers are always under the impression that they talk less than half the time in their classrooms. But if you actually measure the amount of time that teachers spend talking versus students spend talking, it's often teachers are talking 80% of the time. And so students are learning less than they could, right? And so one of the amazing things about TeachFX is they've shown in randomized control trials that after 5 weeks of using a product that actually tracks the level of student and teacher dialogue and gives the teachers tips on how to improve the quality of dialogue with their students, talk time for students and participation from students improves 25%, right? So that's a huge actually change in just 5 weeks of intervention. And so learning, the broader point is that learning technology can make learning more efficient, and that's a huge opportunity. And the last thing, and I will say this is probably the biggest problem in learning, there is almost nothing worth learning that doesn't take time to do, right? It's just, and so the hardest part about learning is not necessarily the act of learning, it's the time that's required to come up the learning curve, right? Almost anybody can learn almost anything if they spend enough time doing it. Most people who don't learn what they want to learn just give up, right? It's not because they can't do it, it's just because they can't find the time or they can't find the motivation stick with it long enough to learn what they need to learn. And so the opportunity for for education technology is to drive engagement, basically to drive that, to create that motivation. And here the example I often give is Epic, which again, like if you actually just give access to things that kids want to read, they'll spend more time reading, right? Like that's ultimately the secret of what they're doing. And then what they've done is, like Netflix, when they found particular topics that kids were, or particular formats that kids were more interested in, they created their own books to drive even further learning, or even further reading around that. So anyway, those are kind of the big opportunities in edtech. It's not quite the new trends, but I think companies that go after those opportunities are in pretty good shape.
Thank you very much for this. Lots of knowledge coming right behind from one single question. I think we're reaching the final stage. Now let's get back for a second to figures, numbers, number games. What are the key indicators while investing in a startup? What factors Bright Eye take into consideration while measuring the potential of a startup?
Yeah, so I mean, I wish there was you could just look at X number, like if you just have this one number, you would know whether you were in or out. I think for us, it's a bit of a continuum, and the continuum is really about how differentiated / defensible is your product versus sort of traditional business traction. So to make the point a little bit more clear, like if you had a product that could like in the Matrix, if you could just beam information into people's head and they would know how to do karate, or they would like learn a skill right away, we would invest in that. If it was a single person with no customers, no nothing, if you had the technology and it worked, right, it's super defensible, it's unique, and so you invest in that right away, right? If you're building a sort of online math course, of which there are thousands, if not hundreds, tens of thousands, right, available, then the amount of business traction that you need for us to sort of build conviction around that is higher, just because it's a more competitive market and it's a less differentiated product, right? And so you would need tens of thousands of users and probably a fair amount of revenue in order for us to invest. I will say, we are typically not pre-product investors. I think there are some people who specialize in that. We need a product, and we typically need to see that the way that users are behaving with that product is different and better than similar, or at least than analogous companies. But we do invest pre-revenue as long as we see that user behavior, and so it just depends.
Okay, thank you very much for this. Thank you for sharing. I think lots of useful information for founders, for potential founders. Ladies and gentlemen, I highly encourage, if you would like to learn more about your investment opportunities, how to scale up your educational startup, how to build it, please feel free to reach out to Bright Eye. They have been working on several successful initiatives. They will be certainly happy to help in terms of building software behind it, in terms of designing mobile or web applications. Feel free to reach to me or any of my Merrick Studio colleagues. We will be happy to help you with this. In beginning of June, we will be coming back with one more show. More details to be announced soon. Meanwhile, thank you all for watching. I hope this was insightful for you, and see you soon, ladies and gentlemen, all around the world.
Bye.